mean, I'll talk for a few minutes, and then to basically give you the gist of it. Then let's just have a discussion about the topic for as long as it lasts. It was a few years ago. I remember there was a survey done. I don't remember how serious it was, about professions and how they were viewed by the public. And I think the bottom three, in terms of esteem, were journalists, politicians, and estate agents. I cover two of those three because I'm a journalist and broadcaster by profession, and a politician in terms of councillor and parliamentary candidate. So all I need to do is to sell a few houses and I'll be sort of ripe for utter contempt. But I'm actually a graduate as well, and that combination of journalist and graduate teaches you two ends of the information spectrum. In the academic world, you have to write things that stand up to close scrutiny. If you're postgraduate, you have to be able to develop a hypothesis and develop into a theory in papers that are subject to peer review, where everything will be scrutinised and everything has to be carefully phrased. The other end of the spectrum is the press, where you're basically into the realms of selling information. So you package your information in a way that it'll sell best. And in a way, when we're dealing with the ways tuition fees have been portrayed, it's as much as anything a matter of the result of portraying a complex argument through a few slogans and a few headlines in the media. And so you get slogans like betrayal, U-turns, broken promises, and this sort of ubiquitous £9,000, as if that somehow sums up the whole business of tuition fees. Now, there is an argument, a logical argument, for saying the Liberal Democrats did the wrong thing. But it's not an easy argument. And what I'd like to do is just explain how it all came about, so you can see where that argument comes from, and you can see why we did what we did. Go back to 2001, where Labour introduced tuition fees. They'd been in government since '97. They flagged it up. We opposed it. They introduced them, set them at £3,000 a year. In 2005, we again opposed them. We said we would abolish tuition fees if we got into government. Labour carried on with the fees. They stayed at 3,000 up to 2010. In 2007, the economy hit serious problems. I remember the night when Northern Rock was bailed out by the government. Northern Rock was this building society just demutualised, and it hit the buffers. There were other big names as well. Lehman Brothers was another one that went out under at the same time. But the government bailed out Northern Rock. And I remember watching the news the night of the bailout, and the political correspondent, I forget who it was, it might have been Nick Robinson, said, "Tonight the markets are calm, but the real cost is to come somewhere down the line." And that real cost is the austerity measures that we've had to face in the last few years. So, following the... Oh, someone's coming. Hello. Come in.
Come in.
So, following the bailout of Northern Rock, Royal Bank of Scotland, and other aspects of the financial system, it was clear that as all political parties prepared their manifestos for the 2010 general election, they had to look at the costings. There would be so much less money to spend. And within the Liberal Democrats, there was a real debate. Can we afford our pledge to abolish tuition fees? And there were plenty of people, some of them are in government now, people like Vince Cable, David Laws, Danny Alexander, who said, no, we can't. This is a lovely idea. It's core to liberalism, but in the current economic climate, we can't afford it. And there were others who said, we must afford it. Liberalism is all about equality of opportunity. If we do not pay for higher education through the state, certainly up to a certain point, then we are failing our commitment to equality of opportunity. And there was a real battle. Part of the Lib Dem's democratic structure is that we have this group called the Federal Policy Committee. And it's basically a committee of leading activists, some of whom have been members of parliament, some of whom are members of parliament, but many of whom are just dyed-in-the-wool liberal and liberal democratic, social democratic activists who believe passionately in liberalism, however they define it. And the Federal Policy Committee was the one that was really fighting to keep our commitment to abolishing tuition fees. And there were some stormy meetings, and one of them, Vince Cable, walked out with a rather terse comment, which should not be repeated in polite society. Hello. For a while, it wasn't clear what would happen. But out of that battle, out of that stormy battle between those who said, sorry, in the current economic climate, we cannot afford our commitment to abolishing tuition fees, and those who said, we must, it is a central core of liberalism. They worked out this policy, which was in the Lib Dem Manifesto for 2010, and the policy was to phase out first-degree tuition fees over a period of 6 years. It was a costed policy. The word costed policy is one of those classic, it's become a cliche, but what that means is we had to work out how we would pay for it, otherwise it wouldn't be worth the paper it was written. And we knew we couldn't do it in the lifetime of one government. So we had this policy to phase out undergraduate tuition fees over a 6-year period. For us to have done that, we'd have needed 2 majorities, one in 2010 and one in the next election after that. You could say it's unrealistic, but we went in there with that policy because it was important to lots and lots of people within the Liberal Democrats that we fight for no tuition fees in higher education. So, in the run-up to the election, 2 things happened. One, we were approached by the National Union of Students saying, will you sign our pledge? Our pledge says, if I'm elected, I will not vote to raise tuition fees. Now, one of the things that's not widely reported, there were about 24 pledges going around. I stood in Wealdon, a constituency up in the north part of East Sussex, in 2010. And I got, between about 20 and 25 pledges. Some of them I just signed straight off, from all sorts of campaign groups. Some of them signed straight off. Others I referred to Lib Dem Policy Office to say, look, is it safe to sign this one? Especially if they were asking us to do things which would require us to take action if we were elected. And I remember referring the NUS one. I said, look, this seems perfectly reasonable. Can we sign this? And the message came back, yes, you can sign that, because it's consistent with our manifesto. I asked Nick Clegg in April 2011, I was interviewing him for the biography I wrote about him. Do you regret signing the pledge? He said, no, it was consistent with our manifesto, so it was the right thing to do. Off the back of signing that pledge, and off the back of saying, we have this policy of abolishing first-degree tuition fees over a period of 6 years, we picked up a lot of votes. Many of them from students, but others from people who support higher education, members of faculty, parents of students nearing university age who perhaps had financial reasons for supporting it, plus those who just felt it was the right thing to do to support no tuition fees for first degrees. So we picked up a lot of support from that. At the same time, the Labour government asked Lord Brown, he of BP and Quadrilla fame, to undertake an investigation into the funding of higher education. And in the run-up to the 2010 general election, both Labour and Conservatives committed themselves to enacting the Brown recommendations. Now, he hadn't reported by 6th of May 2010, election day, so they must have seen what was in his report, but they'd committed to that. So you had these 2 things going on. You had the Labour and Conservative committing to the Brown report, and us pledging to abolish all first-degree tuition fees over a period of 6 years. Then, what happens in the election? We have a result where the only viable government was a Lib Dem Conservative coalition. I know there was talk about Lib Dem Labour coalition, but that would not have meant a majority. And although it was unlikely that a majority would have been amassed against it, it was unworkable. It would have meant every vote was a knife-edge vote. And you can't run a government like that, especially when you're looking to establish confidence. So the only viable government was Lib Dem Conservative. So where does this leave our tuition fees pledge? Well, it was clear that the Conservatives didn't want to budge, and they basically said to us, Labour went in with the same pledge to honour the Brown report. Oh, that's right, Brown then reported, and the headline from the Brown report was no cap. Universities should be free to charge whatever they want. So in other words, the cap would go up from 3,000 to whatever. And the talk was of the Oxbridge colleges charging 15,000, 16,000 a year. If they can afford it, that's what Brown was happy for them to do. So where did this leave us? It left us with two options. One, we could stick to the letter of our pledge, not to vote to increase tuition fees. Or we could use the leverage that we got from all the votes from higher education to go into bat to get the best possible deal for higher education. Now, it wasn't easy, and there was a major debate that went on. If you're wondering whether there really was a debate, there was, because in the coalition negotiations, Lib Dem MPs were given the right to abstain without it being disloyal to the government on the tuition fees issue. So it was clear that we needed the right to abstain, but there was also a strong case for saying, okay, if we're going to do anything here, we have to use our leverage to really fight. And the option was chosen by the Lib Dems in government to fight for the best deal possible. And we got 4 concessions. And actually, we got a lot more than 4, but 4 are really worth highlighting. Firstly, there was a cap. Okay, that's worth saying. Everyone talks about, oh yeah, tripling of tuition fees. If we'd left it to Labour and the Conservatives, there would have been no cap. So the fact that there's a cap at all is down to the Liberal Democrats. Secondly, that cap was 6,000. Not 9,000, 6,000. So where does the 9,000 come from? We said the cap must be 6,000, but we will allow an extra 3,000 as long as this is directly conditional on universities giving places to youngsters from low-income families. And there's a formula, a definition of that. And that was very important because it not only created more opportunities, but it gave us information about how many students were coming from low-income families so that we could actually measure the policy. The third was that we raised the payback threshold. You do not pay back a penny until you're earning 21,000. It was originally 15,000, but we said that 15,000 is ridiculously low. It would be nicer to take it above 21,000, because 21,000, if you're in the London area, is still very, very low. But it was at least an increase from 15 to 21,000. And the fourth thing, it is time limited. So if you haven't paid it all back after 30 years, the remainder gets written off. Now then, the choice we had is important, because you can make out an argument for saying we broke the pledge. We did, because we said we would not vote to raise tuition fees, and Lib Dem MPs, some of them at least, did vote to raise tuition fees because they voted for the package that we negotiated. If we had voted to stick to the letter of the pledge, we wouldn't be sitting here now talking about tuition fees as a Lib Dem broken promise. We'd be sitting here talking about tuition fees as Lib Dem impotence. What is this party? It gets 23% of the vote, it goes into government with the Conservatives on a big issue which it campaigned on, it gets steamrolled by the Conservatives. And that's what would have happened. Instead of which, we fought for those 4 things. And what those 4 things have effectively done is made tuition fees into a graduate tax. So why don't we call it a graduate tax? Well, there are 2 reasons. One is a slightly cynical one, but it's true, and that's that George Osborne promised that there'd be no new taxes. So he's quite happy for the Liberal Democrats to break their promise, or to be seen to break their promise, as long as he doesn't break his. So he calls it tuition fees because he doesn't mind having a charge for things. That's like going into a shop and paying a price for something, but he does not want a tax. Well, if you get the service, you don't pay up front, you then pay afterwards based on your ability to pay. That to me is as much a tax as it is a charge. But all right, so George Osborne doesn't want to call it a tax, we'll call it tuition fees. The other reason why we don't call it a graduation tax, which is a more substantial reason, is that if you do your degree in this country and then you go abroad, if it's a graduate tax, you escape it. Whereas if you stay in this country, if it's tuition fees, you have to pay it back even if you're abroad. So it actually gets round the idea of people using the loophole of going abroad to get out of paying back. So it's actually fairer for the Exchequer in total. Now then, what happened when we took that option? We were panned politically. You know all about that. Lib Dem betrayals, broken promises, U-turns, 9,000, tripling of tuition fees. There were even effigies burnt of Nick Clegg. Now imagine that. This is a father of 3 boys. His boys at the time were 9, 7 and 2, and they're burning an effigy of him. I hope nobody in this room supports that. That was a absolutely dreadful thing to do, and it doesn't reflect well on democracy. People can disagree with us. I've made that point. But look how it's worked out. Has it cut down the number of people going to university? No. The numbers went down in the first year, but really, if you look at UCAS figures, it's because the moment this policy was announced, the moment the deal was done in government, a lot of people tried to avoid the 2011-2012 academic year if they could get in the 2010-2011 academic year. I got my years mixed up. I think I'm 1 year behind. But, so in other words, people who would have taken a gap year didn't, so that they got in on the last year of 3,000 tuition fees. But those numbers have picked up now, and in fact I think the latest figures are that we're back up to where we were. Yes, record numbers. Entry rate in 2014, total acceptance in higher education at their highest ever level. So it hasn't actually detracted from people going to university. Has it disadvantaged people? No, it hasn't. And in fact, the opposite's true. It has narrowed the gap between the equality of opportunity for children from higher income backgrounds to those with lower income backgrounds. And again, we know this because of UCAS figures, because of this mechanism that allows universities to charge up to 9,000 when the cap is at 6,000. We have this extra information. The rate of disadvantaged students applying to study higher education hit an all-time high, this is 2014-15, with 18-year-olds living in the most disadvantaged areas in England 72% more likely to apply to higher education in 2015 than 9 years ago. So in other words, there's a real social equality element to all this. And I tell you, if the Labour Party had done this, they'd be screaming from the rooftops. They'd be saying, look, we've actually done something to reduce differences in social equality. The Liberal Democrats have done it. And what happens? We're the ones that get panned for allegedly breaking our promises. So my message to you is, if you wish to disagree with the stance that we took in late 2010, there is a logical basis for doing that, because more than half our MPs did vote to increase tuition fees. But they did so as part of that package, which I think was realpolitik at its best. The climate going into the 2010 general election was that people wanted a new politics. They were sick of the old politics. Okay, a lot of that was expressed in disenchantment with MPs' expenses and with the voting system. And we wanted to change the voting system. But a lot of it was also a dissatisfaction with the way government works. Now we have cooperation in government. The Conservatives got 37% at the last election. We got 23%. It is right from a democratic point of view that more of their education policy gets adopted than ours. But look what we achieved. Look what we achieved in terms of compare it with what it would have been without. We have really achieved something. And it's not been easy. It's not a perfect solution. And it's interesting that Labour is not pledging to abolish tuition fees. It's talking about reducing them to 6,000, but it hasn't worked out how to do it yet. was an article in the New Statesman a couple of weeks ago about, well, maybe Labour should pick certain courses in which maximum tuition fees for those courses are 6,000. But the cap at the moment is 6,000. So I hope Labour's not proposing to abolish the condition that allows universities to charge an extra 3,000 in return for making places more available to disadvantaged students. Students are the cream of our academic elite. And I expect people to disagree with us. I expect to have robust discussion. I just hope that the student world is willing to embrace the full picture. Because if you think about what you do, go back to I started the extremes of information, you deal with the details, you deal with getting to the truth, exploring ideas. And if you disagree with the view we've taken, fine, but please disagree within the context of the whole thing, not on the basis of some lazy journalism by newspapers who, to be honest, were still getting over their indignation that there wasn't a clear that lot and that lot, that we had a coalition. So where do you deal with the third party now that they're in government with one of the two major parties? They really had it in for us and painted us into a corner that I don't think we deserved. We took a lot of stick for that, and I think we've done a reasonable job. I think that's as far as I need to go at this stage. Thank you for listening, and let's open it up to as much discussion as we can fit in between now and 7 o'clock. Any comments, reactions to that?
So isn't the poorest third of graduates, they're paying less overall on the new system than the old system?
Yes, I gather that's the case. I mean, there's a lot of detail in that, and I've tried to keep some of the detail out. I mean, I've kind of brought along pages worth of figures, but at the end of the day, any system of education needs to respect what society needs. The whole point about having a state, having a government, is that we need to look after the whole country. And I think one of the big parts of the higher education thing that I left out of my talk is actually the support that we ring-fenced for further education, 16 to 18-year-olds, not just as a gateway to higher education, but as further education as a safety net for an awful lot of the 16-year-olds who leave school without a properly functioning literacy level. And I think that's very important as well. So it's not just about the cost of graduates. It's something that goes all the way down the scale. And I like to think of education. The phrase that's come up is from cradle to college, which I quite like as a phrase. And in a way, the support we've given to preschool education is as much part of helping higher education, because if you give children a good start from 3 to 7, then their ability to get into higher education, if that's what they want to do and if that's appropriate to their intended development, is so much greater.
I also read that the difference between the poorest and richest students in primary school and the English and maths levels has decreased to record levels.
Yes, that's true.
Because of the people group.
Yes, it has. It's still too big, but you can't do everything overnight. But I hope we carry on working towards reducing that.
What do you think about international student fees?
Well, I suppose I don't have a problem with them. What I do have a problem with is suggestions that students who are funded internationally and who often pay more money than students in this country, that they somehow are owed their qualification even if they haven't earned it. What I would like to feel is that irrespective of funding mechanisms, the integrity of the qualifications remains the same. So if somebody from this country comes away with a degree in whatever from the University of Sussex, that is worth the same as somebody from overseas coming away from the University of Sussex with the same degree in whatever the subject is. So, you know, I don't see a problem with international students. One of the wonderful things about Brighton for me as a city is its international nature, that you actually hear different languages, and I think universities should have that where it makes sense. I think it's great that some British students choose to go abroad, but it all has to fit into your funding model so that we know that higher education is financially viable.
What do you say to the argument that the Lib Dem, you weren't pushing tuition fees enough in order to get the AV referendum through?
Yeah, it's a good question that. We weren't pushing tuition fees enough because we wanted to get the AV referendum through. The 2010 election will be looked back on as, I think, a transitional election. I think you'll see the manifestos at this coming election will look different to previous manifestos because parties now know that they have to have a manifesto, not just to say what they do if they were in government on their own, but to say what they do if they were in coalition. Now, our manifesto had on its front page 4 headline policies. Raising the income tax threshold to 10,000, the one that David Cameron said was a lovely idea but couldn't be done. A boost for the green economy, so that we actually made our economy more in tune with environmental reality. Boost for education in the form of the pupil premium, and cleaning up politics. Those were our 4 headline issues. And in a way, the reason why the Conservatives were more professional about going into coalition negotiations with us than the Labour Party were, was that the Conservatives actually looked at what we stood for and said, right, okay, these are your 4 policies, this is what we will offer you on each of those. Whereas Labour didn't do that. So irrespective of the parliamentary arithmetic, Labour were much less businesslike about going into the coalition negotiations. So in a way, changing politics for the better, of which an alternative voting system was a big part, was always one of our red line issues. Tuition fees wasn't. Now, I remember talking to Aaron Porter, who was the president of the NUS in the autumn of 2010 when this was all happening. And he said to me, the night that I saw there was a hung parliament, and a few days later when there was a Lib Dem Conservative government, I thought, great, well, that means there'll be no Trident, there'll be a proportional representation system, and there'll be no rise in tuition fees. Well, I'm sure a lot of people thought like that, but that's his interpretation. We never made tuition fees a red line issue. We campaigned on it because it was in our manifesto. And the nature of politics, and this is what will happen, I think, in this coming election, is that you've got to decide what's most important to you. Now, I don't think anyone will actually have red line issues saying we must do this, because if you're going into negotiations with one party for a possible coalition, it may be easier to get certain concessions than another, than if you're going into government with another party. You have to respect their major issues. But I think we will see different manifestos this time, and I don't think we reneged on fighting for the abolition of tuition fees because of that. Where you might have an argument is that this battle within the Lib Dems between certain economic liberals in the parliamentary party as against the more social liberals of the Federal Policy Committee, the people who were actually dealing with the issue in government were the economic liberals, the likes of Vince Cable. I mean, universities, further and higher education, doesn't fall under the Department for Education, it falls under the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills. So Vince Cable was the minister for that. And you could argue, well, he wasn't convinced about the policy of abolishing tuition fees over 6 years, so there wasn't a great willingness on his part to go into bat for it. You can argue that. I don't think it makes a great deal of difference at the end of the day, because we still have the same dilemma. Do we say, this is what we pledged, we'll stick to it, or do we say we're going to go into bat for students using the leverage we had? So I don't really think we pulled out through a lack of willingness. I just think we saw greater scope for doing a better deal for higher education by working with the Conservatives to get serious concessions, rather than say, no, we never said you could play with our ball and you can't.
I always have a lot of people saying to me that about the alleged broken promise on tuition fees, is that perhaps we should have broken a promise in a different area because of the nature of how many votes we gained because of the tuition fee policy. So the students that you mentioned and stuff like that.
But what does that mean in reality? Faced with what I said in my talk was just an attempt to present the reality that we faced in the second half of 2010. Now, by all means, come back with a different approach. By all means, say we should have said, no, we campaigned for no uprise in tuition fees, therefore we're not going to support it. What happens at the end of the day? I suspect what happens is you get an awful policy, the Conservatives take a bit of flack, people say we're impotent, so we take some flack as well, and higher education loses. You know, there's a phrase, government is the art of the possible. It's a cliche, but cliches are cliches because they're true. They trot it out a lot because that's what happens, and government is remarkably difficult. And here we had a situation where we'd gone into an election promising something, we'd ended up in coalition with a party that was doing almost exactly the opposite. They got more votes than us. What do you do? What would you do if you had that? Imagine a similar situation. You're in your family or your social club or your work if you've got a job, and you're arguing heavily for something, and eventually the patriarch of the family gets you all around the kitchen table, or a boss gets you all around the meeting room table and says, right, okay, let's thrash this out, work out what we're going to do. Everyone puts their point of view in and you work out how you can move forward together. Now, slightly different in politics because your weight of numbers matters because of the votes. But it amounts to the same thing, and what we did, and this is the thing that I'm so frustrated that we've taken such stick on, we actually said, okay, what needs to happen here? We received a lot of votes from higher education. How can we use what leverage we've got based on the situation we're in? And I don't see that we could have done much better for higher education. We might have done slightly better for the Liberal Democrats. But what are you in government for? To achieve things, I hope. Has anybody changed their view on tuition fees, having heard what I've said with background?
Yeah, I'd say so.
Yeah?
I was already swaying. I mean, I knew it wasn't all the Lib Dems' fault.
Right.
There was more to it than the media was making out it to be.
Yeah.
But yeah, just hearing some of your points has just convinced me that you're quite right.
Just important to clarify that if the Lib Dems voted against the policy, the Brown report would have gone through almost in full with unlimited tuition fees.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
So if you voted against it, you would have had a worse policy, but it would have been good for the Lib Dems. So, like electorally.
Well, would it have been good for the Lib Dems? You see, this is the point. There's this parallel universe that says, oh, well, if we hadn't done that, it would all have been better. I mean, I said in my little talk, we wouldn't have been talking about Lib Dem broken promises. We would be talking about Lib Dem impotence.
Yeah, people listen to Lib Dems. You were in government, why didn't you stop it?
Yeah, I voted Lib Dem because of your pledge on higher education. You were in government. What the hell did you do? That's the parallel universe that no one takes into account. So in a way, we were damned if we did and damned if we didn't. And you know, it's interesting what you were saying about, I'd got this sense that it wasn't all the Lib Dems' fault. I mean, leaving aside fault or whatever, there's a lovely phrase which I keep coming back to. If something seems too good to be true, it probably is. And the same goes for many of the, oh, it's all the immigrants' fault. Well, you know, that seems wonderfully simple to those who wish to believe it. But most of us know that it's a lot of nonsense. Without people coming in from abroad, our economy would be in a right mess. You know, if you say, oh yes, it's all the Lib Dems' fault, the chances are that's just a sort of, it's a way of expressing your anger about something that you haven't quite got your own way on. And I think that's what happened. And, you know, students are eloquent and intelligent and know how to get publicity. And a lot of those demonstrations in 2010, I thought were, I mean, they were great at one level. I'm always pleased when I see students out demonstrating on the streets. I wish there were demonstrations about more than just what affects students in the pocket. I mean, you know, I think it'd be great to have seen some demonstrations, you know, in favour of the environment or in favour of human rights in various places, you know. I'm sure a number of students did join some of the demonstrations over Syria, and there was one about Libya, wasn't there, a couple of years ago. You know, I think it's good to express yourself, but I do think there's also a requirement to think of the big picture, and to remember that if government was easy, we'd have discovered how to do it years ago.
People can ask questions about other issues as well. People are interested.
Yeah. Can I ask one of you guys? I mean, what does the word tuition fees mean? Is there any, when someone talks about tuition fees, if you hear the word tuition fees in the news, or somebody mentions it, or you see a poster saying talk on tuition fees, what does it bring to mind? What's the reaction?
I know a lot of people, like, who I've talked to are just kind of like, oh, it's just, well, if like the one that we had on campus, you know, we're talking about the tuition fees, the Lib Dems are talking about tuition fees.
Yeah.
I suppose it just brought to mind, oh, they're just going to be telling us that it's all right, kind of thing, like, that they didn't do anything wrong, that kind of thing. That's what a lot of people have said to me, just kind of making excuses almost. But
Okay.
I suppose if excuses need to be made because they're valid, then people should perhaps lend an ear.
Any other reactions to tuition fees?
I think you're right in the sense that it needs to come across as a tax. It's not really it's not a charge. It's very much a tax in all but name.
Yeah.
And it definitely doesn't come across that way. I mean, in terms of how people feel about it, but as soon as you think about it, that's what it is.
It's part of the problem, the fact that we think of tax as a sort of, tax has a negative overtone to it. We don't think of price as a negative overtone. If you go into a shop, you don't expect to sort of pick up a bottle of wine and walk out with it, and when the shopkeeper says, oh, excuse me, you owe me £7 for that. What? You know, we expect to pay for things. But when we're taxed, which, let's face it, goes to doing everything from our schools to our collecting our bins, we somehow don't like that. Is the word tax perhaps at the heart of it?
I was just wondering what your opinion is of Lib Dems' ability with the media, in terms of, like, should they not have done more to explain this? Why haven't they? How
That's a
could
good
they?
point. And that's actually, I was going to come back to your previous point about, you know, explaining it, making excuses, understanding the reasons. So much of today's politics is fought out through the media, where you're lucky if you get a 12-second soundbite or a 50-word quote in a newspaper. It's very, very difficult to develop an argument. Now, how long did I speak for? About 20 minutes? Must have been about that. I can't give 20 minutes to everybody. I can't do 20 minutes on the doorstep when I knock on people's doors and say, will you vote Liberal Democrat? And therefore we are dependent on the media, so you have to condense everything into these short sound bites. And the best soundbite ever for me was Tony Blair when he was Shadow Home Secretary. Developed this thing, tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime, which is brilliant because it sort of addresses those people who are worried about having their house burgled, and also those people who want to be sympathetic to the people who are driven to crime. Brilliant slogan, and somehow what we never did was found as a way of saying, of describing what we did on tuition fees in 12 seconds, or even 4 seconds. But I do think that a big part of that is the media. I mean, I'm a journalist, so I know how the media works. And we were taught at journalism college, always give both sides of the story. And if Labour think you're for the Conservatives and Conservatives think you're for Labour, then you're neutral. It's a bit fatuous, but it completely breaks down when you have a third party, especially when that third party joins the government. The BBC haven't known how to deal with it. How do they deal with Question Time? Suddenly the Lib Dems stopped being on Question Time because they said, oh no, they're part of government. So we have one person from the government. It's either a Conservative or a Lib Dem. And 1 week in 5 it could be a Lib Dem. You know, people in the media, it shattered their the framework that they were working to, which is there's left and there's right. And therefore the idea that the centre party actually brought a sense of social fairness into a fundamentally conservative policy. It's too nuanced. And that was the problem.
Is it all the media's fault though, or what are the systems?
It's not the media. It's not all the media's fault, but you know, when you're fighting a battle and everyone's saying, "Oh, Lib Dems, tuition fees, betrayal," it's very hard to fight back when enough people say it.
Fair.
And that's, I'm afraid, you know, I think it was Churchill that said, democracy is an awful system. It's just that, you know, all the others are worse. Because, you know, you are dependent on, shows you the price, you know, the influence of information. And if you control information, why do you think Murdoch's so powerful? Because he controls information and the organs of information from which control how people vote. Fox News in America is even worse. I mean, I don't know how the Republicans would survive without Fox News. It's quite disgraceful. But there we go.
What are the Lib Dem policies on like tackling issues like that within the media then? Like in the previous manifesto and perhaps this one as well?
Well, fair media ownership rules. You know, the Competition Commission needs to come in when the media gets too much. But the problem is, unless something's actually wrong, you can't actually tackle that. I'll tell you a really good exercise to do. Read The Guardian or The Independent one morning, and then shortly afterwards read either The Express or The Mail. Same stories that you've read in The Guardian. And see the difference. It's not really the phrasing. You'll notice differences in phrasing. It's what's left out. You know, the Mail and the Express will leave out salient points that make the story nuanced because they really want to work in black and white. They work in, if you like, the principle of fairy tales. Sort of, you know, you're either very, very good or very, very bad. And life is the shades of grey in between. And you can't actually say, you have misrepresented this story just because you've left out a few facts. So, I don't see what you can do, and while I condemn my own profession in many ways, I go a long way to defend it as well, because the media is, well, a moderately free media offers the checks and balances against despotism in government. And let's be clear, it's the media that got the HSBC story yesterday. And thank goodness it did. It's the media that got Nixon back in 1973. You haven't seen all the President's Men, it's worth doing. I mean, Ben Bradley, the New York Times editor, the one who died last year, he probably saved the USA from a military coup, but a very quiet one that Nixon was carrying on. You know, it's as strong as that.
And the expenses scandal.
Sorry?
And the expenses scandal.
The expenses scandal?
In the UK.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, the media got that. I'm quite right. Expenses scandal is a funny one. Because if you look at the root of that, this is another one where you have to understand the full picture, then you understand what happened. Back in the 80s, a parliamentary commission investigated MPs' pay and said, MPs are underpaid. If you want good people in Parliament, you need to increase by quite a way the salary of MPs. Not because MPs deserve more, but because you're getting too many people who would be really good in Parliament who say, yeah, I'll go into Parliament. Oh, blimey, is that all I get? Well, for half the amount of work, I can get twice as much of that in the city, or working for a limited company. So what happened was that they recommended that, and Thatcher said, no way, we're trying to keep wages down. We're not having MPs awarding themselves a massive pay rise. And so they reached a compromise. They created this pool of expenses so that MPs could claim for all sorts of things, which is a way really of increasing their income without giving them a pay rise. It was a fudge, because it suited the politics of the day. And it's amazing it took 20 years for the expenses scandal to break, because, they were claiming for all sorts of things because they could. And in a way that was almost encouraged. And then a couple of years ago we had another report that said the basic MP salary should go up from 66,000 to 74,000. And yeah, it was about a year ago, wasn't it? And there was outcry, oh my goodness, everybody's struggling, we've got austerity measures and MPs are awarding themselves an 11% pay rise.
But it meant that the expenses would be severely cut.
Yes, absolutely.
So that should cost the same amount of money.
Yes.
But it just,
cost less money.
Yeah, they just transferred the expenses into
exactly.
wage. Less prone to fraud.
Absolutely.
Save money.
But the headline, and this we're back to the media again, the headline was MPs award themselves, MPs set to award themselves 11% pay rise. And so all three party leaders said, oh, I'm not in favour of this, because they were running scared. They were running scared of the headlines that were being put through the media.
Yeah, save money. Yeah.
Even though they've saved money, public money would have been saved under that system. This is your problem with democracy when it's run through the media. The headline is what dictates your political climate. And it's wrong, and it's horrible, but the alternative is dictatorship.
So I guess another example of the media is the phone hacking scandal, which is really important.
Yes, absolutely. No, the media is a twin-edged sword.
It was Vince Cable who blocked Rupert Murdoch's takeover of Sky. We tried to, but then he got...
Yeah, but Vince Cable was a little bit unsubtle about this. Vince Cable said, albeit in a private discussion that should never have been recorded, that he was, on a war footing?
Yeah, at war with Murdoch.
Yeah, exactly. Now, given, as a Democrat, rather than a Liberal Democrat in this particular answer, I think it's right that somebody who sits in a quasi-judicial capacity should not have a predisposition on something. And if Vince Cable, as the Secretary of State for Business Innovation and Skills, has to judge on the merits of the takeover of Sky News, then he should be neutral from a starting point. Otherwise, it's going to be a judgment based on pure prejudice. And in a way, the lesson that was learned on that was Ed Davey, the Lib Dem Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change. A lot of people in the Liberal Democrats said to him, you ought to be coming out against fracking. And he said, I cannot come out against fracking if I am to be the minister making judgments about it. I have to go into this with an open mind, and if I think fracking is dangerous, I have to set a strict safety framework so that we're not actually saying fracking is wrong. We are saying, if you're going to do fracking, it must guarantee public safety in these... And that has to be right as a matter of principle. The European Commission got itself into a tangle in the 90s when it said that it was for catalytic converters and against the lean burn engine. It couldn't say that. It had to say motor manufacturers have a target of maximum this amount of CO2, maximum this amount of nitrogen oxides, this amount of carbon monoxide. And it's up to the manufacturers to find technology to fit. They can set the standards knowing that a catalytic converter will meet it and that lean burn engines won't, but it can't discriminate in favour of one technology over another. So the example of Vince Cable, I think, when I said he was unsubtle, he had to maintain a degree of neutrality to maintain his quasi-judicial function in that matter.
Well, on that note, I think it's nearing.
You need the room at 7, don't you? Someone's coming in at 7.
Yeah. So, is there anyone got any last questions?
Well, thank you for coming.
Shall we just a round of applause for Chris? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And also, can I just take this opportunity to plug the debates that are coming up? There's a series of 4 debates coming up between the political party societies, so the Lib Dem Society, Labour, Tory, Green Party Society, because there isn't a UKIP society yet, but if there was, then they would be included too. Yeah, so they're coming up, and it'll be between the political party societies, and it's just a really good opportunity in the run-up to the general election to get to know the differences between the parties, so you know who to vote for, or if you've got any friends who don't really know that much about politics but feel they should be maybe getting interested if they're because of the general election, then this is a good opportunity to come along while you can directly compare between parties to make an informed decision on different points. So the first one's next Tuesday, 17th of February, next Tuesday at 5 p.m. Place to be confirmed, but it'll be advertised, so don't worry about that. Thank you very much.